morning, everyone. You're very welcome to this session. I hope you're enjoying your morning. We've had some really great speakers this morning, and this afternoon we will also have some amazing more speakers and panel discussions this afternoon. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining either it's one session or a number of sessions. We're delighted to have you here. So thank you. We will just give it another few minutes or a few seconds to let people into the room. Okay, I think we might kick off now. So my name is Ruth Clinton. I am the Industry Engagement and Partnerships Manager here at E3 in Trinity College, Dublin. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to open this session, Navigating Supply Chains in an Uncertain Climate, Future Trends and Challenges, with Professor Omera Khan. Professor Omera Khan is Global Head of Strategy and Planning at AP Møller Maersk and is an internationally recognized leader in supply chain risk management and resilience. With over 20 years of experience spanning academia, research and industry, she's worked across multiple sectors and is a sought-after keynote speaker. We're delighted to have you here, so thank you for that. Previously, she held an academic position at Royal Holloway University of London and Cranfield University, among others, and led high-profile research projects. Professor Khan holds a PhD from the Alliance Manchester Business School and is the author of several influential books and publications in supply chain management. She is also chartered fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. So without further ado, I open the floor to Professor Omera Khan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm really happy to be invited here today and to join such an esteemed group of speakers and to really share my perspectives at the conference today. So given the nature of the volatility with what we're seeing in the marketplaces, I've also adapted my title a little bit for today's session. And we're going to be focusing on this kind of perspective that we are, kind of living and breathing through what we call a polycrisis. So the agenda that I've put together for today's presentation is as follows. Supply chains are increasingly exposed to, numerous compounding effects of multiple crises, and all of these have the potential to disrupt our supply chains. They range from geopolitical uncertainty, climate disruptions, to socioeconomic shocks, and a profound technological transitions. And this is what creates the so-called polycrisis. And what I really mean by this is like when numerous crises interact in a non-linear and unpredictable ways. So with that in mind, conventional risk management approaches often fall short in addressing the complexity and interconnectedness of these challenges. I'll give you an example here just to begin with. The continuous geopolitical disruptions that are hampering our sustainability efforts is one very good example. I will then share with you some of the opportunities and challenges of technology, which I term the technology paradox, because whilst there's significant benefits of technological innovations, the challenges of adopting some of these and recognizing their full potential, I believe, are still yet to be fully realized. I will then share some ideas for embracing an innovation mindset, disrupting the status quo to prepare for a future where uncertainty is a given. So that's the agenda that I have for you today, and feel free to post any questions, which I will take at the end of my presentation. So let's go into the first section on looking back at the last, few decades or so. It's really startling to consider the many disruptions that have rattled our global supply chains. In fact, we could say that we face the most disrupted landscape. It's an era marked by mass geoeconomic and geopolitical tensions, climate change, and very fast changing sort of customer sentiment. Now, in the last few weeks, the impact of the US tariffs and their subsequent retaliations will reorder global trade and supply chains. While the US remains one of the largest global economies and key markets for Maersk and many of you, I believe, and many in the logistics trade, their protectionist policies will no doubt push other nations and trading blocs to reevaluate trade agreements and develop new partnerships and build upon those that are already in place. In fact, I actually added this section in primarily because I was asked yesterday by our executive leaders to put together a one-page risk assessment summary on what the US tariffs will mean to our Maersk business. And in some ways, we will see some quite negative impacts, but in other areas of our business, particularly where we work in humanitarian aid and relief and defense logistics, we will, of course, see quite an upturn. Now, looking at some of these risks or these disruptions here, you could argue that many of these are unexpected. They lie outside in the wider supply chain. However, they are systemic in nature and they occur because of a failure in our supply chain system. So let's take a deeper look into the drivers that influence this disrupted landscape, but very much through a polycrisis lens. Now, this is very Maersk specific. I created this a few years ago in my previous role as head of supply chain insights and trends lab, where I was trying to connect the various internal and external impacts that I feel impact the Maersk business and the impact that it actually has on the Maersk industry verticals. So like I said, it's very Maersk specific, but I think you can get the general idea. Because this concept basically opens up the various different threads through which you can begin to see some of the connections. Now, the challenge with the polycrisis is that these are multiple crises, multiple layers of crises that are interconnected and they amplify the risks. The key drivers that I've listed here, and of course there could be many more, very specific to whichever industry that you come from or very company specific. But for us at that stage, it was very much on climate change, economic instability and geopolitical tensions. And of course, the impact of technology change and the downside of that, which of course is cyber risk. And some of you may know in 2004, we faced one of the biggest cyber risks and that impacted and closed down a lot of our systems. But today we've learned from that and we have one of the most cyber secure businesses in the world. Now, the impacts could be governance sort of failures. It could be supply chain disruption. It could be social unrest and so on. Now, what we can really, I guess, assimilate from this is that going forward, we know that geopolitical relationships will remain tense. Some supply chains will be shaped more by political choice than by economics, and also by the increasing impact of climate change. And I think one of the key points here is that we very much stand at the crossroads of a very changing and evolving global economy, in which the resilience and adaptability of our supply chains has never been more critical. Now, for logistics service providers like Maersk, DHL, and so forth, this means adapting to new demands for flexibility and responsiveness. I truly believe that technology will be a great enabler. The use of advanced technologies and particularly artificial intelligence will provide end-to-end visibility and real-time data to help customers mitigate some of these disruptions, but it will also help to improve responsiveness and efficiency. Now, I think it's really important to also note that there's a very strong likelihood that this current climate of turbulence and volatility will continue. So therefore, we really have to find ways on how do we build resilience into our supply chains. And this is not a new thing academics have been saying. We've been saying this for the best part of, I guess, 20 years. I know when I started my career at Cranfield 20 years ago, we were developing frameworks and models and solutions on embedding resilience into supply chains. And while it's cliche to say that we're living in an age of uncertainty, this really is the reality. So we really need to change our focus from developing sort of, I guess, focusing very much on just robust systems, which are very silo in nature. And I can see that in some of the organizations that I've had experience of being in, but shifting very much towards a more responsiveness mindset and agility mindset so that we can navigate our supply chains forward. And to do that, it's imperative that we actually understand all of these interdependencies of risks and disruptions, these crises, and how they all connect to each other, because as they cascade onto each other, they actually create a much bigger impact than a single risk factor alone. What we've also got to do is change our mindset from crisis management into thinking about how do we turn crisis into an opportunity. So we've got to understand the crisis interactions for better responses. We should think about adaptation. So how can our systems become more resilient? And we should also think about developing an innovation mindset so we can actually start considering how do we gather foresights and insights so we can develop solutions for long-term stability. Now, logistics will play a vital role in this transition. They need to find new ways of looking at new ways of working, new business models, and we're already seeing those dynamics within the logistics industry. Things like new alliances are being forged, new ways of integration, for example, is happening within shipping companies like Maersk, for example. We're going through one of our biggest corporate transformations on actually shifting from just being a shipping conglomerate to actually moving towards more end-to-end integration of our supply chains. So we're seeing a lot of changes going on in the industry. And with consumers and businesses that are becoming more environmentally minded, companies are also shifting more towards looking at supply chain as a service business model. And it's this sort of servitization of key industries, most notably that we're seeing in our fashion verticals, retail and automotive vertical, that lean very heavily on ideas like reverse logistics and, which draw upon circular economy principles. And as we start looking at reducing carbon and trading more responsibly, looking towards more recycling, refurbishment, and reselling products as a service to our customers, we're seeing a much more widespread use. Now, whilst, in the meantime, the global trade landscape is also undergoing quite a seismic shift with emerging trade hubs that are challenging the dominance of traditional industry powerhouses. We're seeing India, Mexico, Southeast Asia emerging as, really formidable alternatives, offering cost competitive structures to the traditional powerhouses such as China. We're seeing access to much larger labor pools, and we're able to scale capabilities across various industries. Now, for the logistics industry, I think a lot of these transitions, they present a lot of challenges and opportunities. And if we look through the lens of the poly crisis, it's very useful to see how interdependent these drivers of disruption are. So let's just take an example of how, what I'm talking about here in terms of the interconnections of the poly crisis. If we look at this chart, it shows the impact of rerouting to avoid the Houthi attacks in the end of the last quarter last year, and how this impact was having on the rise of carbon emissions. As you know, in the Red Sea, we had this ongoing armed conflict that is causing carriers to go around the southern tip of Africa. And this actually adds an additional 3,500 nautical miles and potentially around 10, 12 or 14 days additionally at sea. Now, as you can imagine, that has huge ramifications for delivery time, for inventory, for availability, and for working capital. And this is just an example, just one example of many showing how an event, which for all our best endeavors in meeting global sustainability targets, some of you may know Maersk was the first shipping company to launch its methanol vessel. So for all our best endeavors, a geopolitical disruption can knock all of that out of kilter. And, because there's very limited available options to keep goods flowing no matter what, we had no choice but to go around this southern tip. Now, here we see another example of the interdependencies of polycrisis, where global regulations are pushing supply chain more towards localization, and at the same time reducing the impact of disruptions that are more prone to global supply chains. So you will all know that the pace of regulations are being introduced to global economies is increasing. The EU is driving this agenda, but the rest of the world is following very fast. If we just look at the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, which basically stipulates that no more than 65% of an EU's annual consumption of each strategic raw material at any relevant stage of processing from a single third country by 2030 will be allowed. Now, we're obviously undergoing we're in a moment of a lot of change since some of this research was conducted, and we're yet to see if if there will be some changes to the IMO is obviously in discussions with the shipping industry to see if there's going to be any subsidies available and support available. But in the general, we are seeing a lot of shifts, particularly in the EU, and some will say that this can be quite detrimental often, because while we have very strict policies governing what we do as EU industries, the same rules don't apply for nations that sit outside. But nevertheless, we are recognizing that it is forcing companies to go much more globalized. Now, I think the final example I'd like to share with you is that this also leads us into what we call, the rise of sort of sovereignty and supply chains. During the pandemic, the supply chains that had previously been considered trustworthy were also found to be quite fragile, and this led to a change of focus towards supply chain sovereignty. And this is pretty much a company's ability to maintain control over its supply chain and minimize dependence on external suppliers. But it also involves ensuring that critical aspects of the supply chain, such as sourcing of raw materials, manufacturing processes, and distribution channels, they're all managed much more internally, or they are managed by using trusted partners. It's a term that we're also now talking a lot about these days, about allied shoring. And whilst this is a lot more complex than it sounds, trust, is eroding internationally, and we can see that happening right now on a daily basis. Now, prior to the current US administration, so under Biden administration, the US had established the Council on Supply Chain Resilience and Defense Production Act to make essential medicines in the US and mitigate drug shortages, as well as offering manufacturing grants and incentives. So this was called the IRA Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. And similarly, the Australian government was also offering funds to support new manufacturing domestically. So basically what we were saying here is that we're seeing several nations basically develop a much more protectionist system. And of course, without talking too much about what's going on the other side of the world now, we can see that sovereignty is very much on the agenda, and sovereign supply chains could really change business trade significantly. And of course, there's going to be winners and there'll be losers. In the previous government, Mexico was already benefiting by China using it as a backdoor, but of course, that's now quite questionable as well. So what I'd like to now do, just checking on time here, is really take you through what I call the technology paradox. And what we are seeing is that technology is a great enabler and will continue to be a great enabler, particularly for our logistics and supply chain industry. From in the warehouse, on the roads and on the skies, we're seeing an increased adoption of automation and robotics. And this is already a $6 billion plus industry. On the roads, we're seeing autonomous vehicle technology, which is readily available. But the framework around using the adoption of that technology, like we're not really seeing driverless cars or driverless trucks, for example, readily available. So the technology is still being developed, but we are seeing increased adoption of platooning, where 2 or more trucks will, travel together in a digitally connected network, such that the trucks are basically following or mirroring what the lead truck is doing. And then the third area of digitalization is hardware being up in the sky, where drone deliveries are not just technically feasible, but they have become economically viable. And we're seeing companies like FedEx, DHL, UPS doing last mile deliveries using these drone technologies. And if we then start to throw in technologies such as blockchain, cloud computing, mobile computing, and also software as a service, which means we don't need to have investments in software and hardware, but we can use a pay on per use basis, like a subscription model. Then with all of these technologies available and easily accessible, digitalization is really, really changing the out of what was possible into the out of what is doable for our industry. Now, I'd like to say that digitalization, it is a journey still, very much in many cases. It's a journey that isn't going to end anytime soon. It's an endless ride. And every company needs to be on this digital journey. If they're not, then they're really going to be left behind. But I think the biggest digital frenzy, like all around us right now, is AI. And we have the question of whether, is this an opportunity or is this a challenge? And I don't really have the answers for that. I think time will tell, but I tend to think that it's more of an opportunity than it will be a challenge. But there's no doubt that it's a real frenzy right now. And I think one of the biggest issues is this, FOMO. It's the fear of missing out. And this is what's fueling the frenzy about artificial intelligence. We have super inflated expectations of what it might be able to do for our business, whether it's good or bad. But I really think that it's time now to just take a breath and pause and think about how do we calibrate what the expectations are around artificial intelligence for our business, for our supply chains. Ask yourselves, what can it really help us with? And how will it help us do? Like, how will it help us do that? Like, of what matters? And then what kind of timelines are realistic to expect? So I think where I see a lot of companies fail is that we have this sudden surge. We jump to the real sparkly things and get really excited, but without really having a thorough understanding of what's the purpose for what it should be used for. So we have this big surge in AI right now. A lot of businesses are not having a very clear roadmap of where it's going to take them to, and then they end up creating these islands of excellence, which are not joined up together. And unfortunately, we also know that there's downsides of these new technology, and that relates to cyber risk, as I mentioned earlier. These will, of course, increase because as we increase down the track of technology, we also expose ourselves to increased sort of dependency and therefore disruption to scams and hacks and so forth. So we have to think about the downsides of all of this technology development and learn how we will potentially deal with any potential bad actors that are capitalizing also on the power of artificial intelligence. Now, where this will lead to, I'm not really sure, but I think this sort of report or this framework that was published by the Gartner Technology Research Group, they developed what was called the technology hype cycle. And this is where Gartner plot emerging technologies on typically what happens before they become actual realistic applications in business. And then they develop these 3 phases over time. And this typically takes around 3 to 5, it could be 7 years to get through this cycle. So we can see that we're very much sort of at this high, this point of peak of inflated expectation. And that really reflects what I said about this frenzy where everybody's talking about AI, everyone's excited about AI, but we're not really sure what, how, where, and when. So it's probably going to be, I would say a few more years before we see the commercial realization of artificial intelligence and how it can help us and support us in our journey. And now we start moving into innovation and developing an innovation mindset. We've talked about obviously the poly crisis, the cascading effects of disruptions and how we've got to build greater resilience. And I think a lot of resilience is very much about disruptive thinking and disruptive innovation. And I think for me, an example of sort of, new ways of looking at things, new approaches is, this idea of, moving towards a more circular and regenerative economy, where we've got to start thinking about shifting from incremental to exponential change, looking from ownership to sharing models, think about how do we de-risk our supply chain at that very early stage of the supply chain on the drawing board, and the shift from linear to circular, which we are seeing a greater adoption in our industry. As Maersk, we are seeing a lot of interest from our customers on looking at how we also incorporate reverse logistics, and hence why I'm sharing that idea with you here today. But very much it's about this mindset change from looking at how do we become more as a value orchestrator for our customers as opposed to a commodity logistics transporter? And I think one of the most disruptive sort of, I guess, ideas that I kind of came across was reading the work by John Elkington on green swans. Now, green swans, I mean, you've all probably heard of black swans, but green swans offer exponential progress in the form of economic, social, and environmental wealth creation. So it's all about breakthrough innovations. And if anyone has heard the story of the ugly duckling by Hans Christian Andersen, they will remember the beautiful swan that actually started off as an ugly duckling. So let's just put this in the supply chain innovation context. Now, I'm no fan of Elon Musk, but it's a good example to use here to demonstrate what I'm really referring to as that, what could start off as what seems to be a bad idea. It starts off as out of sight for most people, but it can gradually lead into something that actually disrupts an entire industry. So a potential green swan is the adoption of electric vehicles. It started, as no one was interested, but it gradually accelerated step by step and then went on to disrupt the entire automotive industry. So the first stage, think of it as people will never, no one's going to leave combustion engines. The second stage is about taking ownership and saying, okay, I'll go alone and I believe in the idea. It may look like an ugly duckling, but I'm going to invest in it and move forward with it and develop it myself. So this was Elon Musk's decision to start Tesla, producing electric cars himself, but couldn't get investments. And then comes the breakthrough. Other people, other industries started looking at it, they started reflecting on it, and they started actually to see how they could replicate this idea. So the third stage was replication. Think about how other car makers then started making this transition. And then the fourth stage is very much about resilience. It's about solidifying and protecting against possible disruptions. So think here about the current charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. And finally, where we aspire to be, but we're not there yet, is all about regeneration. And this is where the entire system shifts from a linear resource consuming system to an increasingly circular regenerative system that can sustain over time without harming our planet, or even it can help to restore it. So I think the key point I'm making here is that, consider ugly ducklings. Don't be blindsided by it, because, what looks really weird today could be tomorrow's breakthrough innovation. And I think in today's polycrisis world, we really do need to start thinking in a much more disruptive and innovative mindset in our industry. So we now move to the final section of my presentation today. And I think very much just to recap on what I have covered in my session today. The New World Order very much requires organizational resilience. Supply chains are exposed to this compounding effect of multiple crises, which I refer to as the polycrisis, from geopolitical instability to climate disruptions and so forth. So recognize that our conventional risk management approaches are not really fit for purpose in today's world. We've got to address the complexity and interconnectedness of all of these multiple crises. Through the lens of the polycrisis, I also explained the drivers of disruptions that all cascade onto each other to create the uncertain climate that we have to find a way of navigating our ships through, navigating our supply chains through. And I also talked about the technology paradox and the AI frenzy. I mean, who knows where we will be in 10 or even 5 years' time, but we know that innovation and innovation mindset can help us to improve and challenge the status quo. We've discussed, how we shouldn't get blindsided by ugly ducklings and remember, to dare to disrupt, because your ugly duckling could become your next breakthrough innovation. So I think that, think about how to conduct supply chain drills, knowing your weakest failure points. They will help you to stay prepared as we start to see a rewiring and a recalibration of global supply chains. Invest in responsive solutions, remain nimble, in this new world order, in this ever-changing world, you don't want to make too many concrete investments right now. Think about pre-booking capacity and procuring for resilience. Apply radically new thinking and new approaches to being more sustainable and resilient, and don't be blindsided, like I said, by the ugly ducklings. So rethink how you can measure and upskill and reskill your workforce. I think this is something that we often see in organizations is the last thing to change. But your biggest return on investment are your people. So we've got to start thinking about how do we retrain and reskill our workforce to remain current in the new world order. So I'd like to thank you on that point. Hopefully I finished just in time. I'd like to thank you for your attention and wish you an enjoyable rest of the day. Happy to take some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really insightful, and just the amount of information, and you have just I suppose explained it and described it so clearly. And really, the challenges that are with the landscape, that's the political landscape that's going on at the moment. They're really challenging, but I love the way you have brought in the element of the AI and how that can be shaped to businesses, and the Gartner hype cycle. It's not about just the hype; it's also about how that fits into businesses and how that suits your business to be the best that it can be, and to be resilient, and to be able to disrupt where you can. So thank you. That was absolutely amazing. I think we have some questions that we will jump onto. We have a few minutes for a few questions because we know you're very busy. So Dean Kelly from Verizon Global Procurement has asked, do you use tools that aid your ability to identify or mitigate risks?
Yes.
For example. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you. Great question. Yes, we have risk. We have a risk department, so we have various folks in there who develop tools. We've just, I think, launched a logistics trend radar as well that looks at the different impacts and disruptions that we will see that specifically impact the logistics industry, but also Maersk. And we also have our own internal consulting team that are constantly looking at the disruptions and impacts that might actually impact on Maersk. So it's quite a proactive organization with, of course, we can't anticipate every risk that comes our way, but I think the important point here is to consider that I think having the foresight and investing in foresights and looking at what trends may come and developing the scenarios based on those foresights, I think that's really key, and that's what helps us in Maersk to stay ahead of some of the challenges.
Okay, and Dr. Charles Mazanhate has asked, what are the key performance indicators we should track to monitor supply chain performance and identify potential issues early?
Thanks. Your volume was a little bit low then. I think you said, what are the key performance
indicators we should track to monitor supply chain performance and identify potential issues early? Can you hear?
Yeah, I think that's a very tough one because I think it's very dependent on company by company. I think even within Maersk, depending on which product area, which product grouping that we might be talking about, our KPIs will change with that in mind. For example, our sales teams, our sales colleagues are measured on, of course, the number of sales they bring in, whereas our strategy folks will be measured on in very different targets. So I think it very much depends on company to company, but it could be on cost or value. And again, I think if we consider where my new role is now in Maersk Project Logistics, we very much look at how do we achieve the outcomes for our customer. So we're a very outcome-based we're a very outcome-based product within Maersk in Project Logistics. We very much behave like a 4PL almost within Project Logistics. So it's very much on delivery service and responsiveness on our customers' outcomes. Have we achieved the desired result of the service level agreement for our customer?
Yeah, and with just one more question, I think it's similar to what you're after saying there from Harris Mustafa. In the context of rapidly evolving global risks, how can organizations effectively reevaluate and future-proof their supply chain training to ensure agility and resilience, especially when legacy systems and siloed structures still dominate in many industries?
Yeah, brilliant question.
Mm,
I think the challenge here is that we do have a lot of legacy systems, and you simply can't just say we're going to have a new technology system to replace in order, to serve the world that is dynamic and changing all the time. I think what we have to do is balance like what it makes sense to have, but then have the agility. So it's understanding how do we decouple from having a base system that is resilient already, but where when we have upturns like we do now, and when it's cyclical and so on, how does our business behave in that current in that climate? Do we have the structure flexibility in our supply chains to be dynamic? So do we have the bandwidth? Now, Maersk is a very asset-rich organization, so we have a lot of reliance on, we own all our warehouses and distribution centers and aeroplanes and trucks and so on, right? So we have the bandwidth to chop and change as we need to respond to our customers. But at the same time, one could say that having such expensive assets can also restrict us in the sense that if you've made a lot of investments in a certain part of a certain region, for example, that is then knocked over, you can't simply just divert those assets as well. So I think my answer to that will be is that one way for certain is to ensure that we try to limit and reduce the bureaucracy that we see in a lot of organizations that only adds complexity. So we have a lot of layers of paperwork, we have a lot of layers of management, and it would really help if that can be smoothed out. So there is one set of numbers, one set of paper, one set of strategy documents, and we don't overcomplicate that. And also that will help to remove some of the silo and often fragmented nature of our corporations, of our businesses. Look, it's a challenge for me as global head of strategy and planning. It's something that I try to work on a daily basis, but it's not something that you can fix in a day, not something you can fix in a year. We're on a journey like everybody else. We're using foresights and trends analysis to help ourselves improve as well. But at the end of the day, Maersk, we're a big tanker, we're a big ship. Um, I often see myself as that little yellow digger that was next to the evergreen ship trying to dig ourselves out of the hole. And that takes time. But I really believe, like some of the perspectives I've shared here today, it's not necessarily exactly what we do here at Maersk, but it's also my perspectives as an academic and years of working in supply chain risk and resilience to share with you that if we can incorporate some of an innovation mindset, we develop that resilience and agility into our supply chains, and that can definitely help us move forward.
Absolutely. And if anyone would like to look at any of the publications from Professor Khan, you can maybe take a photo of the books or the publications that are in the bottom corner of this slide that might be useful. So look, with that, I think we'll close the session. We can't thank you enough, Dr. Omera. It's just been fascinating. Insights are amazing. The research element, what you're bringing into your role and into your strategic role is amazing, and we can't thank you enough for being here today. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.